What for? What for? What for?
Wisdom requires to bring the mind and the heart together. It requires emotional intelligence. It requires empathy. And for that, we need stories and the art of storytelling.
If you read a variety of novels by a variety of different people, you get a much deeper understanding of how the world works.
Not only are we the biggest thing affecting the planet, but we've suddenly reached a point where if we don't wake up to that and respond accordingly, it's going to come back and bite us really, really hard. And that moment is now.
So I think if you can just reach out to somebody, to that isolated person, whether it's in your office or within your community, you could really change someone's life and maybe improve your own.
The atmosphere here is always of people who love books, longing to see a book, an event, an author that they love, and it's just palpable, it's wonderful.
I've been to book festivals over the world. This is the best. This is the gold standard for book festivals.
Hello, I'm Jo Hall and welcome to the Edinburgh Book Festival, coming to you from a completely new venue at the Edinburgh College of Art. Today's event is Whose Side of History Are You On? And it's part of the schools programme made possible by our sponsor Baillie Gifford, which is fantastic. So we're in for a bit of a historical treat today. I've got two authors for you, and we're going to be talking about two of their books in particular. We're going to be talking about Cane Warriors and When the World Was Ours. These books from two very different times in history, but books based on true stories and that have a story to give something to us in this day and age, which is really special. And the authors are pretty special too. We have two writers who write for children and young adults. They write contemporary fiction as well as historical fiction. And let me introduce them to you before anything else. So I'm joined in this lovely studio by Alex Wheatle. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
Okay, and also by Liz Kessler, who is, where are you, Liz?
Well, I'm in the northwest of England. I'm in Cheshire.
And you're coming to us from a video link, which is great. And we are in this amazing, this is Castle View. I've never been in a studio like this. This is so cool. It's very cool. And we've got also joined by people watching in schools around country, and we want you to join in our chat as well. So please go to the question and answer box and pop in your questions there, and later on we'll ask Liz and Alex to answer some of those questions. So get writing them in for us. So we've got a lot to talk about this morning and a lot of weighty things to talk about, but I wanted to start with something a wee bit lighter, and I was looking for somewhere that the three of us maybe have connected at some point. And when I was Reading about you guys, I thought, you know, it has to be comics. We'll go to the comics. I was a whizzer and chips girl myself down at the newsagent, and I know, Alex, comics were a big thing for you when you were young.
I was a Sculpture boy, and Beano and the Dandy.
Beano and the Dandy.
And sometimes in the children's home where I resided, they were discarded. Oh. And I used to get up early in the morning and fix them all together with a bit of sellotape and for later reading pleasure in the evening. So that is my first reading experience.
That was you. What about yourself, Liz? Were you a Whizzer and Chips woman?
It was Beano as well, and Whizzer and Chips. And I remember I actually had a subscription, which was like this amazing thing. And on a Saturday morning, you'd hear the flop as the Beano landed on the doormat, and it was very exciting. I can't remember which one it was in, but I used to, my favourite was the numbskulls, who were like these little men that operated inside a man's brain, and you know they had these fax machines that gave instructions from his brain to his arms and things like that. And yeah, anything that was a little bit quirky, loved it.
Yeah, that was fun. I guess my favourites were the Bash Street Kids and Lord Snooty. You remember Lord Snooty, Liz? He was great fun.
Yeah. And the Bumpkin billionaires who used to, they tried to get rid of their money, but everything they did, they used to get rewarded by another £1 million. Yeah, it was great.
So let's go from that very light topic to something a tad heavier. So we're really leaping across here to your fabulous book, When the World Was Ours, set in World War II. It says in the front cover, 3 friends, 2 sides, 1 memory, inspired by a true story. Can you tell us a wee bit more about that story?
Yeah, so my dad grew up in Vienna as a very small child. He was born in 1930, and in 1934 he had an experience where he'd had whooping cough, and his father took him on a trip on a Danube steamer on a boat as a gift for getting better. And while he was on the boat, my dad was kneeling on a seat and his feet were sticking out behind him, and this lady came and sat next to him. So my grandfather told him to be careful. And the woman said, "Oh, it's okay, don't worry about it. What a sweet boy." And they got into conversation. It turned out that she was English, and she was there with her husband, who was a dentist. They were on a dental conference in Vienna. Anyway, they got into such conversation with my grandfather that they missed the stop that they were meant to get off. So he said, "Look, I'll take you back to your hotel, but first come back to ours and meet my wife and have some of her cake, and maybe tomorrow I can show you around Vienna," because they had a free day. So they said yes. So they did that, and then a little while later, my grandparents received a thank you letter from Gladys and William Jones, the couple, on their headed paper from their dentist. So that was 1934. Cut forward a few years when Austria was annexed, and my family, a Jewish family in Austria, were and at that point it became subject to the same laws as Nazi Germany, and they had to get out. So they managed to go to Czechoslovakia because my grandfather was originally Czech, but within less than a year the Nazis had come there too. By this point, there was an enormous amount of stuff they had to do to get out. It was almost impossible as Jewish people to get out. And they managed to get everything in place apart from one thing, which was they had to have a signed affidavit from somebody in another country to say that they would take care of them. And they didn't know anybody else from any other country until my grandfather was going through some files and he found the letter from nearly 5 years earlier, and it had the address on it, and he wrote to them and said, "Can you help?" And they said yes, and they did everything. They sponsored them. They got my family out. They went to live with the Joneses for about 6 months in England, and they saved, undoubtedly saved them from concentration camps, probably saved their lives. And this has just always been in. This has been in me. I'm sorry that I took so long telling you the story, but it's just been such a big part of my life that it's always been there. And for about 10 years, really, I knew I wanted to write something inspired by it, and that's basically the starting point for this book. That there's 3 children. One of them has an experience similar to my dad's, and the other 2 are very different.
Yeah. So, I mean, he is a third of the book. Your father really is a third of that book. And did you just take the essence of it, Liz, or did you actually use a lot of your dad in there as well, do you think, from stories and past?
Yeah, so the actual moment where it happened, I did take that. But I went on a research trip when I was planning the book. And when we went to Vienna, I was looking for an old Danube steamer, and they don't really, they're much more modern. And also, we've been having quite a grim time visiting concentration camps and delving into the Holocaust. And so we went to the fair in Vienna to give ourselves a night off. And it was when we were on the Reisenrad, the big Ferris wheel, that I thought, I think that moment's going to take place here instead. So I changed little details like that, but they had the same experience of finding the letter. There were also other than that, it goes in a completely different direction. I actually pinched off my dad. My dad has written about this, and I did pinch a little scene off him of crossing the border, where with a lot of fear and having to be searched and the way they were treated. But the actual story of Leo, whose story is inspired by my dad, his story once he comes to England is, he is a character of his own. It isn't my dad's story. It's very much inspired by my dad. But then, it follows the same trajectory. Yeah. But then he has his own characters' experiences here.
Yeah, it is an amazing story. It's quite an emotional read and a heavy read. And I think for me, that was because that I know a wee bit about the Holocaust and kind of saw what was coming down the tracks. But what were you thinking for your younger readers? Were you thinking that they knew about the Holocaust at all, or did you just assume a blank slate?
No, well, so actually, can I just go back a step? Because I just wanted to say also, so Leo is the character that was inspired by my dad. And like for years, my dad said, you're the author. Why don't you write my story? And I was like, well, I know I want to, but it was never my dad's story that was the one thing on its own I wanted to write. Because what's always fascinated me as a writer, and I'm sure, Alex, you'll relate to this as well, it was always the what if. It was never just tell this story. And for me, it was like, what if that tiny moment hadn't happened? What if he hadn't knelt on his seat, or Gladys Jones hadn't sat there? What if? And so the second character of Elsa, who's a Jewish girl, she answers that question, and her story is very upsetting. And then there's a third friend as well, Max, who isn't Jewish, and he ends up joining the Hitler Youth. And so the three of them are the starting point. Their very happy friendship in the beginning, which goes in three very different directions. In terms of the writing, do you know what? I quite often have my readers in mind, like in writing the Emily Winsnap books about the girl who becomes a mermaid. I quite often sit and I think, now, would my readers want Emily to kiss her boyfriend, or would they kind of think, ew, and they'd rather that she goes and plays with her best friend? But with this, I just focused on the story. I didn't even think, is this for young people? Is it for adults? Which might have contributed to the fact that people have generally talked about it as a crossover book, like probably my first genuine crossover. But it was in the editing, really, looking at the language, looking at how, there were some scenes that were extremely upsetting, and I did scale them back a little bit.
Can you give us a wee essence of it? Can you read a wee bit for us?
Yeah, so I've got an excerpt here. I sort of put two chapters together. It's not a very happy bit, but it's quite hard to find happy bits after the first chapter.
It's okay, you've talked about the comics, we've had our happy bits, we're moving on.
Yeah, we did that. It's told through the interweaving points of view. Now, I have abridged a couple of chapters here to try and cover two things. So it starts in school, and it starts with Max. The headmaster had called a special assembly. In his big, booming headmaster's voice, Mr. Schmidt went straight to the point. If you hear your name, please stand. Heinz Bergman. A young kid a few rows behind Max and Leo stood up. Samuel Adler. Sam Adler was in their year. Melanie Kronberger. One of the older girls stood up. It went on like that, a name, a pause while the girl or boy stood up. And then Mr. Schmidt said, Leo Grunberg. Max couldn't help feeling a tiny stab of jealousy. Leo always did better than Max. He wondered what he'd won this time. Mr. Schmidt put his list back in his pocket and waited for the hall to be absolutely silent. Leo. We citizens of Vienna, Mr. Schmidt began. We welcome our leader, the Führer, and we are proud to play our part in Greater Germany. From now on, you'll hear a new greeting from me. He thrust his right arm forward, palm down, arm straight out, and shouted, Heil Hitler. No one spoke, not even in a whisper. Mr. Schmidt lowered his arm, This is how we will all greet each other from now on, he said. And we're going to show our enemy their true place, he went on. He pointed at each of us who was standing. You dogs no longer have the same rights as everyone else, he said. From now on, you shall be treated like the lesser race you are. You'll sit separately at the back of the room. His gaze moved around the school hall. The rest of you are not to interact with them. Jews are different from us. They are dirty and inferior. The hall was completely silent. No contact. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Mr. Schmidt, the entire school replied, even us Jews standing awkwardly amongst the rest. Max. Max's thoughts were spinning so hard they made him feel dizzy. What was happening? And why did it feel so familiar? He knew the answer. Mr. Schmidt sounded like his father, blaming Jews for everything that was wrong with the world, ranting about how much better off the country would be without them. His face warm with shame, Max stared at the floor and shifted his body a tiny bit in the direction of the other children, the children who still belonged. A small part of his brain knew he was letting his best friend down, but the bigger part had a question beating against it. What if I'm next? Leo. The 12 of us sat at the back of the hall for the rest of the assembly and the rest of the day. Everyone else ignored us as they'd been told to do, even Max. Last lesson with Mrs. Werner, she stopped me at the door. No Jews, she said. The rest of you come in. I watched as my classmates filed past me and Mrs. Werner closed the door behind them. And then I was left alone in the empty corridor. I made my way to the front of the school when, Leo, wait! I spun round. Max. I'm sorry I turned away from you this morning, he said. I'm sorry I haven't talked to you all day. His eyes filled with tears. I nodded. I couldn't speak. Look, I've got to go. Max glanced furtively around. But everything will be okay, he said. I'm sure it will, I replied. As he ran back to the classroom, I wondered if he believed it any more than I did. I couldn't go home. I couldn't bear the thought of telling my parents what had happened, so I walked. I went to the park, to the canal, around the streets, walking and walking until my legs burned and my hands were so cold I could barely feel them. Shame followed me around every corner, clinging to me like a dark shadow. I made my way through the city, blowing on my hands. As I neared the Stephansplatz, there was a crowd of people at the far end, pushing and jostling as they cheered and laughed. As I got closer, I recognised a few of Papa's friends amongst the crowd, in their big coats and their black hats, laughing at something in the middle of the group. I wriggled between the men until I got to the front. I would have given everything I had to change what I saw. I'd have walked out of school in shame 100 times over to make it not be real. There were 3 men on the ground kneeling in muddy puddles, arms out in front of them. It took a second to realise they were scrubbing the pavement. It took us another second to see that one of the men was my father. I felt like a cannonball had been hurled at my stomach. I clutched my mouth. I could taste sick in my throat. Harder! A man opposite shouted in a familiar voice. It was Mr. Fisher, Max's father. He was wearing a uniform with a white armband on it, the shape I'd been seeing a lot lately, swastika. Mr. Fisher bent down towards Papa. A bit of spit sprayed from his mouth as he shouted again. I said, harder! My father looked up at him with pleading eyes from where he knelt in the puddle. Papa, the man everyone loved, the man who could make anyone smile, who would do anything for anyone, my larger-than-life Papa, still in his smart suit and waistcoat, was kneeling in a puddle with a scrubbing brush in his hand. I can't scrub harder, sir, he said. Mr. Fisher took a step forward. Maybe this will help. And then he kicked my father in the stomach so hard that Papa fell forward, his face landing in the puddle. Papa! I yelped as the crowd roared with laughter. From the ground, Papa turned his head in my direction. His white, terrified eyes met mine. His lips moved silently. Go, he mouthed, before kneeling again and resuming his scrubbing. The thought of leaving him horrified me, but the thought of staying terrified me more, so I did what he said. I ran through the square and along the cobbled streets until I could no longer hear the crowds baying and jeering. And then in the quiet of a deserted street, I leaned against the wall and retched over and over until my throat burned and my stomach cramped. Even so, the pain was nothing compared to the ache in my heart.
Oh, Liz, it's just like, you're just, and it takes the breath away, and it's unbelievable that it comes from a place of truth. And
wow,
it is,
I was just thinking that you would have thought that the Second World War for stories have been fully mined, but obviously there's so many untold stories out there that come coming to life now. It's wonderful.
And that's what I was saying. I mean, it's interesting. I knew more about Second World War and those kind of stories. This period of time that you're writing about, Alex, I didn't know anything about. Tell us about the Cane Warriors and that period of time in your book.
Well, in a way, I've come full circle. I remember being presented by my prison cellmate, The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, and he said, read this, Alex. He said, teach you a little bit about your history, your Caribbean history. And so I read that, and it's about the slave revolt in Haiti in 1791. And so that narrative was always in my mind as I began my career. And I've always wanted to write a story similar to that, maybe a fictional story. And 3-4 years ago, I visited my mother in Washington, D.C., that's where she now lives. And I didn't grow up with her, so I'm always eager to learn about her childhood and the stories that she can remember and so on. And she said when she was a little girl, about 5 or 6 years old, she would sometimes overhear the elders mention this great warrior called Chief Tacky. And when I did my research and I discovered that Chief Tacky led a huge slave revolt in Jamaica in 1760, that was, oh my gosh, how comes I'm not aware of this? Because listening to Bob Marley's music over many years, I've heard about Paul Bogle, I've heard about people like Sam Sharp, who were national heroes and fought against oppression and so on. But Chief Tacky, I'd never heard about him. And so I researched it. And indeed, yes, he did lead a slave revolt in the parish where my mother was raised, in St. Mary, which is not too far from James Bond Beach. I mean, St. Mary is a beautiful part of Jamaica. You know, it's where, in fact, Ian Fleming had a house, where Noel Coward had a house. In fact, you can still visit those properties. In fact, my father took me to Firefly Estate, where Noel Coward had his property, and that's very adjacent to Fort Haldane, where the British had a garrison there that Chief Tacky sacked and pillaged and got rid of them.
So tell me, what is it like actually writing for somebody who's real, putting those words in their mouth and building that world around them?
Well, at times, while I was writing the text and undertaking the research, I was reduced to tears because I knew this was real history. And so, in fact, I was going to write the story from Chief Tacky's perspective. But when I did my research and got to understand that some of the young boys, even 10, 11, 12 years old, they were handed out the same punishment from the lash as the men, I thought, this might be even more powerful if it's from a boy's perspective. So that's how Moa came about. And
because it seems like in this day and age, terrible being a teenager and dealing with all you're dealing with, but that transition from childhood into adulthood at that time was scary.
Very, very so, because if you're a young kid on a plantation, your only job was to maybe hunt down rats and vermin or whatever that maybe eat the cane. But as soon as you were strong enough, you were told to go to those fields, and you was hacking from dusk to dawn. And it must have been a brutal experience without any hope. And so the dilemma that Moa has, does he follow his father's wishes so he can live? Or does he risk following Tacky's rebellion where he might be executed? That was the living reality of that day.
Like Liz's book, it's not sometimes an easy book. I don't think it's meant to be an easy book. It's a great book and really well written. Were you expecting the audience to feel that discomfort when they're reading?
Yes, I think so. I mean, otherwise I have not done my job properly. There's some kind of comfort reading this narrative. I wanted the reader to take a breath and say, wow, this happened. And I want the reader to question, how comes I do not know about this? I mean, we celebrate in this country, in Great Britain, the Second World War and so on, and our part that the British played in it, but we also have to acknowledge the horrors of British history as well. And that not only goes for the Caribbean, but India as well, with what happened in Amritsar, the Amritsar massacre, what happened with the Mau Mau in Kenya. We have to acknowledge these horrible narratives, and our children should learn about this. I believe it should be included in the curriculum, just like some of the Second World War, what happened to the Jewish population is included, because they were just as equally horrific.
So can you share a wee bit of that story with us just now?
Yes, I will.
What part are you going to read for us?
This is part of chapter 8, and this is where Moa and his best friend Keverton, they've been given orders to kill their overseer. And so they finished a day's toil in the cane field, and they're preparing to do this deed that they've been instructed to do by Taki and the fellow leaders of the rebellion. We dropped our bowls and mugs in the wooden box. Miss Gloria didn't meet our eyes. Fireflies hovered over her cooking pot. We collected our billhooks from the water tub. I sensed all eyes on me. I glanced up and down the dirt track. The western hills were now crowned with an amber glow. My heart pounded like old Mr. Cliff's hammer when he was fixing a large wheel. I shared a now or never look with Keverton. He nodded. The small creatures in the field had already started their nighttime arguments. I gripped the handle of my knife so tight that redness appeared under my nails. Hermea had stopped putting her handcart on the way to the mill house and watched us. I felt her eyes burning into me. They would soon come for me, Moa. It might be tonight they would drag her out of her cabin. If she refused, they would take her anyway. I didn't want to fail her. My heart started to beat a warrior drum song. I prayed that the sky god, Naomi, would guide me. Pitney stopped playing. Say, I whispered to Keverton, say the door bolted. Bolted or not bolted, we have to kick it down. And then Keverton dashed towards Mr. Donaldson's hut. I soon caught up with him. If my heart could have run, it would have reached the cabin first. We both kicked the door down. Dust flew up in my eyes. I blinked furiously. Mr. Donaldson was taking his rest on his bed. He only wore his pants. His chest and feet were bare. His back ripper was on a table beside him next to an open Bible and a wooden cup. He shot up quickly, not quite believing that he was being confronted by 2 field slaves armed with billhooks. He went for his back ripper. Keverton hesitated. His weapon trembled in his right hand. I didn't want to see Keverton whipped again. I didn't want Mr. Massa to force me to view his broken body. I couldn't bear it to dig Keverton's pit. I didn't want to see him dangling from a thick branch. Fear left me. Naomi was with me. I charged towards my tormentor. The whip crack was loud. He caught me on the neck and the pain was deep and intense. It didn't stop me. Use both hands, Lewis said advised. Dig deep, twist, make sure he don't breathe another dirty breath. My aim was true, just above his left nipple. My blade went in easier than I had imagined it. I turned the blade. He didn't scream. He just let out his final long breath. It was quite something watching the last moments of a dying man. He'd never enjoy a mug of rum again. No slave would ever feel the sting of his back ripper. He'd never molest another Hermea again. He'd never marvel once more at the red sun dipping beyond the western hills. I pulled my weapon out. He fell to the floor, as did the Bible. As I stood still, not believing what I had just done, Keverton leaped on Mr. Donaldson and plunged his billhook into his back 5 times. The wooden floor turned red, staining the book. Some tiny ants scarpered. Some got drowned in the blood. My heart thumped my ribcage. Keverton and I shared a look. We heard screams and cries from outside. I pulled back the white cloth from the window. People ran here and there. All was chaos.
Oh, it's chaos. And my stomach again is churning. I mean, it's so powerful. I mean, when you are writing something like that, what are you feeling? Are you clear-headed or are you passionate? How does that work?
I'm visualizing. In fact, after every sentence or two, I close my eyes and I'm visualize, trying to get into that character's headspace and trying to imagine what that must feel like. I'm just like Liz in her piece. You have to try and transport your spirit into those characters and imagine how their emotions must be running. So that's what I'm concentrating on, the emotions of what they are doing and what they've been asked to perform and how they're feeling inside, that nervous energy, that fear. So I'm concentrating on that.
And I mean, at that time, such a lot happening, such a brutal situation. So how do you measure that up with your young adult audience of how much to share, what to put down?
It's a very good question, and we have to strike a balance. But when I look around the world, Joe, and I see what children and young adults have to tolerate and what they have to try and survive, so many atrocities are happening. I mean, the Second World War alone, I mean, sometimes as adults we forget with children's trauma and what they've actually experienced and what they've had to tolerate. And even this recently with the whole thing what's going on in Afghanistan, I've seen young children on the television sets, you know, traumatized and so on. And I really don't think we tell their stories enough. And so I think it's important for authors like myself, analysts, to bring those stories forward. And so people understand, because usually in any big war, any big conflict, children and young adults are the big losers. And so that's why we must be prepared to tell their stories and do not flinch from the experiences that they have, because they are brutal and there's no shying away from that.
Yeah. Can I pick up on that?
Yeah,
Alex?
please do.
I would just say that I think, you know, I feel the same about your book, Alex, as what I feel about mine, which is that I don't feel like I've written a book that's just about a time in history. To me, I was never actually interested. I was never very good at history, actually, as a child. But like you know, we both did enormous amounts of research for these books. But for me, like what's at the heart of how I feel about my book is that I want children today to feel that it's relevant for them. So, for example, in that piece I read, I'd like children to think, you know, am I the Max in this situation? And am I going to shuffle towards the kids who are, you know, not being attacked at this moment? Or am I going to have the strength to stand up for those? You know, it could be Afghanistan, it could be someone being bullied in your classroom, but whatever it is, for me, it's about making these stories, not only letting young people know what's happened in the past, but making the stories feel so relevant today that young people today can identify and actually find themselves asking the questions of themselves that the characters might have asked of themselves in the books. And that's very important to me.
Absolutely. It's like we're empathy builders, if you like. And so I would like any young person to pick up Cane Warriors or any book with a similar narrative structure to try and understand, because sometimes in the West, we're kind of removed from that pain and trauma that children are going through all over the world, where maybe in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. And sometimes we just turn off our TV sets and think, oh, this doesn't affect me in any way. But I think by writing fiction, we can really dig deep into that and really try to make them understand and empathize with any child in a situation like that, whether it's in 1760 Jamaica, whether it's in during the Second World War, or even today in the conflicts that we see now.
Yes, so important. Alex, can I bring in our audience who are wanting to ask a couple of questions of you? Veronica would like to know, Alex, how did you research someone who has been so hidden in terms of historical knowledge?
That was difficult because Chief Taki's background was Ghana, and there were some contradictory tales. Was he a king? Was he a prince? Where did he actually come from? How did he arrive in the Caribbean? How was he captured? And so I couldn't quite, there was no canon historically that I could rely on. So I decided to build his story from Jamaica. But most of my research was conducted in, there's a couple of museums in Jamaica. There's one in Port Royal, and the Daily Gleaner, the national newspaper of Jamaica, they very generously allowed me to have access to their archives. So I researched that. And also there's a lot of material online as well. And so basically I just took out the basic structure of the story and kind of kept to that. But I did take artistic license in some regard, whatever, but the basic structure, the timeline is true. Where the Trinity Plantation and the Frontier Plantation, that's where the revolt began from. They marched to Fort Haldane, that is confirmed, I can confirm that. And they had a battle, and I won't tell you the end, but I could rely on those bits of concrete information to hang my story on.
Oh, that's good. And Liz, you did so much research. You visited concentration camps, am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, so I started off with books. I mean, I basically lived and breathed the Holocaust for 18 months, which wasn't the most fun time of my life. But started off reading everything I could in books, online, and then went to Central Europe. So we went to, it was a 3-week trip in a van. We went to 5 countries, we went to 4 concentration camps, we went on walking tours in Poland and Austria and Germany and Holland and everywhere. So Czechoslovakia. So yeah, it was full on, and it was very hard. And we visited. I mean, it was incredible. We visited the street that my dad had moved to in Czechoslovakia in 1938, and I sent him a photo and a text, and he said, "You're the first family member to go back there since 1939." And we found my great aunt Elsa's name in the book of names at Auschwitz, and it was incredibly moving, but I was pretty broken by the end of it. But I don't feel that the book would have been what it is unless I'd really been there and delved into it.
Did that trigger anything for you inside? I mean, there's a phrase in my book where the blood remembers. It's one.
Oh, I love that phrase. The blood remembers. And
was that relative for you?
It really resonated with me, Alex. Yeah, I love that phrase. And it's strange because, I'm Jewish, I'm not religious. And I've sometimes found myself feeling kind of on the outside of my community in some ways. I'm not the kind of mainstream Jewish person. I'm gay, I'm not religious. I've sometimes thought, where do I fit in? And actually this trip made me feel this sense of history in my bones and in my, just really deep inside, and this real connection. But at the same time, it made me kind of really despair, because I thought, why is it the thing that finally really makes me feel this strong Jewish bond is about the fact that everyone's always hated us, and the terrible things that have been done to us. And it was, I think I'm still processing it almost 2 years on, actually, of what actually the impact it had. But it had a really big impact for the book, for myself personally, for my family.
It's almost like a spiritual awakening. I had one of my sisters visit Ghana, and she visited the place where the slave ships set sail to the Caribbean, and she said she had an experience that she never had in her life before, where something within her remembered something. And I had the same kind of sense when I actually went to James Bond Beach. Near Ian Fleming's old house, Goldeneye, as I walked along the beach, and I understood that this is where so many of the Cane warriors perished and died, and some of them took their own lives, and so on. Again, I had this strange kind of feeling in my legs, and like I felt kind of crushed inside. And so there's no doubt, I believe, that the spirit does endure. That pain does linger, even though the lost ones might have, obviously gone, but their spirit, I believe, lives in us.
I agree.
So, looking at history again, I've got a question here from Lucy, who is asking, Liz, can I ask you first, did you always like history or English at school? Or maybe you actually like both, who can tell?
No, so as quite a young child, I didn't like either. I was too busy being naughty. I did write poems, actually, although when I was about 9, one of my teachers almost tried to put me off that. I'd been working on this poem, Jinx's Shop, that I'd written, and I showed it to him in the morning, all excited, and he just said, "You didn't write that," because he didn't believe that a naughty kid like me could have done something like that. And I didn't really get on with school until I was 16, and then I had an incredible English teacher for my A-levels. And she was the first teacher who kind of felt like she looked inside and kind of got past the naughty kid who got caught smoking or whatever, and said, "Hey, Liz, you've actually got some talent in there. And if you put as much energy into that as you're putting into, making the kids laugh through the classroom door when you've been sent out of the lesson, then you've probably achieved something." And so she developed the love of English. But no, I never liked history. I got an E in my history O-level, and it was never an interest of mine. And to be honest, it sort of still isn't. It's not really the history
horror
of human lives. The history is a bare kind of, in terms of studying it in an academic way. And I want to pick up on what Alex said, because you know, we kind of, it's the way that history is, is taught, or certainly was it, you know, my generation, that it's, you know, even when we talk about the Second World War, you know, my story and what happened here wasn't because of the British government. It was despite the British government. The British government was still doing what it's doing today and trying to stop people from coming into the country. They didn't welcome the Jewish people in and say, oh, come in quickly, you know. It was very difficult to get in anywhere, and it was down to the generosity of individual people like the Stuarts, who were the real people who got my family in. Those are the people, and it's the human stories in history that the things that do interest me. So.
Well, that kind of leads on, Alex, to a question by Lawrence here, asking, are there any parts of history you think should be taught that aren't?
Oh, definitely. I think I mentioned what happened with the Mau Mau in Kenya. And I think there's more to be explored about what happened in India, especially with the Royal East India Company and their role in what they did there to suppress so many millions of Indian peoples. I'm sure that story would emerge as well. And so I think today we have an opportunity now to hear more of those stories, and more of those stories will get published. Those unheard hidden stories, those hidden narratives. And this is a time now where people are free now to, oh, my family history is important. My nation's history is important. The people I come from, they're important. Their stories and narratives are just as important as anyone else's. I mean, I grew up in the education system here, and so I didn't really take an interest in history because it was just about kings and queens. And to be honest, I was more interested in what happened to the poor people working on the land and so forth. I mean, I remember someone introduced me to Samuel Pepys, is that the way you pronounce it? Samuel Pepys, and I think he was the first one I came across, writing about in those days, I can't remember what century it was, about ordinary poor working class people. So that's what fascinated me, but we don't really teach that in school, do we, in the curriculum? It's more or less about nations against nations, kings against kings and so on, and their feudal battles and so that kind of turned me off.
So do you think young people should be more interested in their own history, their family history?
Absolutely.
And capturing that for stories, Liz? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think it's a really great place to start. And in fact, I had an email from a friend yesterday who said, I'm looking into my DNA, and she showed me that she sent me this picture that said 1% connection with somebody called Kessler, and she said, is it a well-known name? And you know, we just you know, there's so much that we don't know, and to go back and back and back, and actually, I think one of the positives from it is that we might find out that we're all more connected than we realise, and you know, that would be a great thing to discover in terms of the health of us as a world, really.
So where do you start if you're a young person and you're interested in a kind of historical perspective and stories? Where do you start with your own writing? Do you start with a story, or do you start with a period in history and research? Where do you start?
Just sit down with your parents, your grandparents. We could begin with that. In fact, I started a workshop in a school where I asked the students to just sit down with your grandparents and ask them about their childhoods, just like I did with my mother. I think that can be very powerful and affirming. So, and that should generate a lot of interest, I feel, and so they can learn to value their parents, their grandparents' histories and stories, their journeys and so forth. Because even if you're English as anybody, you know, somewhere down the line, you've had ancestors coming from here, coming from there, and so on. So England was never just occupied by the English. It was always people coming in, moving on, and so on. And so all those histories and narratives are very important. So if you can put worth and you know, on your own family history, I think that is a start where we start to value everybody's history rather than just kings and queens and so on.
You were talking about, I mean, you both talked about in your families those stories that were kept in the family, and it was an oral tradition, but would you capture that in a different way to pass that on in this digital world we're living in, Liz, do you think? Or should it still be just a spoken thing?
I think there's room for everything. You know, there's so many different ways to communicate. I love the spoken word. I was saying to Alex before we came on air that because I've been ill lately and I haven't really been reading much, I got Cave Warriors on audiobook. I'm actually so glad I did, because listening to the book, I've just brought it to life, almost like I was in the cinema watching it on a movie. It was, it was such an amazing experience. And, I've been to spoken word festivals where, you get an experience that you couldn't have any other way. But then there's nothing like curling up on your own with a book on a rainy day in a comfy armchair with a dog on your lap. So, I think there's room for all methods of storytelling.
Yeah, so stories endure, Joe. I remember my father telling me that when he was a young boy growing up in Jamaica, there would be storytellers going from village to village, especially at harvest time. And they would gather the fish, because Old Harbour, where he was raised, was a fishing town. And so they would gather the fish, the women would cook the corn and the bread and so on, and they'd come together and they'd have a fire. And then the storyteller would come. And he would tell interpretations of the Bible and Anansi tales and so on, straight from Africa. And the young children would enjoy that. Sometimes they would play act in it and so on. So that was their storytelling. That was their entertainment. And storytelling is in our DNA. Histories are in our DNA. It's something to be enjoyed. It's something we're unique as humans that we do that. So it should be cherished.
That's in the Highland tradition as well, that storytelling tradition where, I remember my granny, my nyangy, used to sit and share those stories, and you weren't allowed to move, right? And if you didn't have an option to leave, you had to stay and listen. But I think it's, as you say, so important. So tell me, ladies and gentlemen, what is next? What are you moving on to in terms of your writing? Are you leaving history? Are you in the contemporary world? What's next?
For me, I've just finished another historical novel set in the Caribbean. This time, I have a heroine hero. That doesn't make sense, is it? A heroine hero?
But I like it anyway. Just keep it going. Keep it going.
But Commercial of the Caribbean, she sails the seas with Captain Henry Morgan. She kicks ass, and she's going to be a joy.
She sounds it. Captain Henry Morgan, was that tied in with the research that you did from your previous
absolutely,
stuff?
From Port Royal, yeah. And he's basically the richest man in the Caribbean.
Really?
And he sacked Spanish ships and pillaged Panama and other places. So I thought, that's a good place to put my hat on an adventure story.
Is that another young adult novel?
Yes, it will be, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And Les, what about yourself? What are you moving towards?
So after a long period of not writing that much, due to, crazy 18 months that the world's gone through, I am working on another book, and it is going to be sort of in a similar vein to this. Can't say that much about it, but it's a couple of strong young women, actually, and it's partly set in the it's one of the girls gets involved in the Dutch resistance, and it's partly set then, and it's partly set in today, modern times as well.
Oh, that'll be looking forward to that. My very last question to you is, if you could go back to any point in history yourself, where would you go? And would you be yourself, or would you be somebody else? We have to have a quick one. You've got a bit.
I think I'll go back to recent history, to late 1950s, early 1960s, Kingston, Jamaica, where the sound systems first emerged, and they had outdoor parties, and where the DJs were carried in on thrones with crowns on their heads and dressed in ermine and so on. And they were placed by tables for their mixing consoles and so on, and they played the music to entertain hundreds and hundreds of Kingston dwellers. So
sounds
I'd love to go to one of those dances.
Amazing. Liz, what about yourself? Where are you picking this back to very quickly?
I'm torn between saying I'd go back 18 months and say, people, there's a virus coming, stop, don't do anything, don't go anywhere, lock down sooner. And going back to, I don't know, I'd like to go back to the Big Bang and see how the universe began.
Well, that is really far back, but all it remains for me to do is to thank you both so much for sharing so much of your work with us. And I have thoroughly enjoyed chatting to you, and I'm sure everybody has thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.